The supposed discovery of Roman artefacts around Newfoundland over Christmas has reawakened questions over Bristol's own role in the discovery, supposed, of America. Did the Romans and the Vikings get there first? Did English fishermen know all about the nearby Grand Banks as a fishing ground but kept it quiet? Were there European encampments even in Virginia and elsewhere before the Matthew and John Cabot began the process of mapping the coastline in 1497? But it's hardly news, but we start this week with John Cabot, and I'm joined in the studio by Dr Evan Jones from Bristol University's Cabot Project. Hi, Evan, and welcome to the Politics Show.
Hello.
Now, when I saw this thing about the Romans over Christmas, I was immediately sceptical. I didn't really think the Romans would manage to get that far. Could you tell us if you've had a look at this and what you make of the so-called discovery?
Well, there are, basically someone has found, I think it's just south of Newfoundland, or they say they found a Roman sword and some Roman coins, and this is their claim that maybe the Romans sort of visited there in the 2nd century BC, AD. I have talked to some people about this, and there is quite a lot of scepticism about these finds. They haven't been found by archaeologists in stratified contexts, so even if they are genuine, and it's not that difficult to buy sort of Roman artefacts on the internet, including things like swords and coins. There's actually no way of knowing right now whether or not they were actually, genuinely found there, or whether or not they might have been put there by somebody.
But he's got a great name, the lead historian, Jovan Hutton Pulitzer. Maybe his family's got something to do with the Pulitzer Prize, who knows? But anyway, he sounds very grand, but he believes the haul is firm evidence that the great empire landed there first, and it's the single most important discovery ever in the Americas. Well, I suppose all historians like to think that, don't they?
Yeah, they do sometimes, and yes, I've read this story, but the difficulty is that sort of no archaeologist has actually found it and said, yes, these artefacts were found in sealed deposit, which we can actually date by other means as being that. In fact, basically someone just turned up and said, oh, look, I found this Roman sword and these Roman coins. They haven't actually been tested yet to see if they are Roman, but as I say, even if they were Roman, that doesn't necessarily prove that they were put there, dropped there by the Romans. So, at the moment, I think you're right to be sceptical. Okay,
now John Cabot is the sort of main person we underline as the discoverer from Europe of America, or at least the first person to map it properly. Although, of course, it's likely that there were other voyages across the North Atlantic before him. So, what do you know about those?
Well, we know that Bristol was involved in a series of voyages from the 1470s looking for lands out in the Atlantic. There's some people who believe that they might have found something, but there's really, to be honest, no evidence of this before 1497.
Aren't we sort of hamstrung here by a quite stark financial, economic fact that if they did find something, if they did find lands, that they were very reluctant to share that knowledge with others, because actually this could be a nice little earner?
Well, people say this, but then the thing is, the logic would be they were going after a fishery, and actually Bristol's never been a great fishing port, and even after they discovered it in 1497, they didn't try to exploit a fishery there, which kind of makes it a bit difficult. There's... and also this notion that somehow you'd be able to keep a large-scale fishery secret over a period of decades is, to be honest, nonsense. Bristol wasn't a closed port. We were trading at this time all the time with Portugal, with Spain. We knew what they were doing, and they knew what we were doing.
So was there complete information sharing? This is one of the things that we do know about in aviation, don't we? Aviation safety is a very good subject, I think, anyway, because every time there's any kind of an accident or a near miss, that kind of thing, information is shared freely and widely. But surely that is not going to be the situation. If someone comes across a new bit of territory, or should we say maybe fishing banks like the Grand Banks, if they start telling everyone else about it, then they're going to be able to share that profit, that knowledge.
Well, let me give you the best example of information sharing in this period. John Cabot sails in 1497, comes back in August. By December, a series of letters have been written to him by Bristol merchants describing to Christopher Columbus, his arch rival, describing exactly where Cabot had been, exactly what he had done, where he'd gone, what he'd visited, how long they'd landed, how many people he had on his ship. All this information got through to Columbus by January 1498, just 3 or 4 months later. That's how good the information networks were, and we know that because we actually have at least one of the most important sources for Cabot voyages is this letter which gets written by a Bristol merchant called John Day to Christopher Columbus, telling him everything he needed to know.
So they were actually quite good at sharing this knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, Bristol merchants, Bristol ships, people going backwards and forwards all the time between sort of Lisbon, Portugal, Spain. You know, each ship, I mean, any ship, a Bristol ship wouldn't have a small number, you know, it'd have a number of mariners on it. They go backwards and forwards. Mariners, seamen talk in pubs, merchants. They have lots of business associates all over the place. There's business people from Portugal working in Bristol. You know, you don't get to keep this sort of information quiet for very long.
OK, what about these earlier voyages? OK, we can probably say unlikely the Romans made it, but what about the people like the Vikings?
Oh, well, the Vikings definitely got there around about 1000. We know that not just because there are written records of the voyages of Leif Erikson around 1000, but there's actually the archaeological remains of a Viking encampment, which is in northern Newfoundland. I mean, you know, and you can visit this site. It's been excavated. It's, you know, the archaeological culture, the remains left by the Vikings are totally different to the sort of Native Americans living there. So we know absolutely for certain that they were there, and actually that people were visiting from Greenland over the next couple of centuries. But then that sort of contact died out when the Greenland colony died out in about the 14th century, and so when people talk about John Cabot, it's really about the rediscovery of North America in 1497 by these Bristol explorers. What
about rumours of other kinds of cultures in North America, not just Native American culture? I believe it's in Virginia, one of the Virginias, rumours anyway, of some kind of European encampment there, which was there before Europeans like Columbus and Cabot discovered America.
Yeah. I mean, the difficulty is that there's, with all these things, I mean, there's a lot of people have a lot of stories because there's this huge competition, to be honest, among sort of people thinking we want to be there first. We want to have got there before Christopher Columbus. And, you know, so you get stories about Basques, French, you know, almost anyone basically has got a story about like, how we got there first. And, you know, I'd absolutely love it, you know, to think that Bristol men had managed to get there first and they had actually been exploring along the coastline well beforehand. Unfortunately, as historians, you know, you actually need hard evidence. You need to be able, like a journalist, you need to be able to go back and trace things back to the manuscript. And too often these stories get overlaid with sort of myths and legends and people saying, oh, X happened or Y happened, and when you actually look into them, there's actually no real firm evidential basis for it.
OK, but you do have to do a bit of speculation, don't you, and then check out with facts afterwards. Are there any other things you point to about communications that were going on between Europe and America before Cabot and Columbus?
Well, you know, Columbus, obviously, there 1492. Really, there's possible evidence that the Portuguese might have reached, there's tentative evidence, South America before Columbus in 1492, or at least around about that time. So, you know, later on, obviously, the Portuguese then went and sort of took hold of Brazil, and so they settled that. So there's some evidence there, but there's really no evidence of sort of Bristol mariners or English mariners actually having visited before 1497. I think there's lots of stories about it, largely because people want to believe it. And, you know, when people really want to believe something, then, you know, it's kind of quite hard to dissuade them.
Well, there's a sort of circumstantial thing, isn't there, Evan, between the Egyptian pyramids and the South American Indian pyramids. They look sort of almost as if they were being designed by people with a similar culture. I wonder maybe, you know, if the ancient Egyptians had some... If there's any evidence
you could say there's quite a lot of similarities between the sort of adobe huts built by Native Americans and very similar mud brick huts built in sort of Mesopotamia or the Near East. I mean, a lot of it is just about sort of the technologies they had available. Doesn't necessarily mean they're actually linked. I mean, probably the strongest reason for thinking they weren't is that if you look at the impact after Columbus in terms of the introduction of things like old world pathogens to the New World, and the devastating impact that had, you know, reduced the population of the New World by 95% over the next century. That wouldn't have happened if there'd been extensive contact between the Old World and the New World before that. It was really these new diseases, new animals, the sort of crops and so on which were brought back in return. All that happened after 1492, and, you know, that kind of rather suggests there wasn't a lot of contact before then.
A lot of people have suggested that some of that was deliberate, that diseases were spread deliberately. Is there evidence for that?
People didn't know enough about diseases. I mean, much later on, there's some evidence of, for instance, in the sort of 17th century, of sort of blankets and so on, which had been possibly infected by smallpox being given. But certainly in those early centuries, people just didn't know enough about disease. They didn't know how it was really spread. So, the things which were killing the Native Americans in huge numbers, such as, a lot of them were diseases which were quite common here, such as sort of measles, influenza, then also things like plague and smallpox, which have been killing people in Europe and in Asia and Africa for centuries. And it's, these introduction of these diseases to people who had no natural immunity, which caused sort of massive devastation, combined, it has to be said, with a very cruel treatment of those native peoples and the enslavement of them as well by the sort of conquistadors and people like that.
Well, I mean, I've been to the Pequot Museum in New England, the Pequot Indians, and the film they show there is pretty frightening. In fact, one of the things that some of the Indians are doing when they first sight the first ships that are coming in the late 1400s, late 15th century, they're seeing, some are saying, well, this is a harbinger of doom, and others are saying, well, actually, no, they're just people like you and I. It must have been pretty horrific for people in succeeding years to see the way they were going to be treated. Effectively, something like, I mean, figures vary for just North America and South America, but it really was quite a devastating genocide that took place over the succeeding hundreds of years. Absolutely,
I agree with you entirely. I mean, it was both the way in which these people, the people were treated, but also, huge numbers of people were sort of massacred. Especially the sort of the Spanish and so on, largely because the English didn't actually follow through after 1497 greatly until the late 16th century. But vast numbers of people died. I mean, particularly of disease, particularly the diseases which are spread through. I mean, diseases which have been killing people in Europe. I mean, remember things like plague outbreaks have been killing up to a third, up to half of the population of Europe in fairly regular outbreaks since 1348. And when these diseases then came to the Americas, came to people who had no resistance to them at all, they caused devastation there.
Is there anything about Cabot's voyage and the man himself that you've discovered over the last few years that you think is added to our understanding of who was behind those voyages and what it all meant for history and the creation of America? Because a lot of people point to America today and say, well, actually, what we did is we created a monster.
Yeah, I suppose, well, maybe not for the American, but it's in terms of,
even some Americans would say that.
I think one of the most interesting things we've been finding out, sort of researching this project, is that, we'd always thought of Cabot's voyages as being purely a Bristol venture. I mean, we know that John Cabot was actually a Venetian. John Cabot is his proper name. He came from Venice in northern Italy. But, I'd always thought of these as being basically an English venture. I mean, one of the things we found is that he was partly financed actually by an Italian bank based in London. I mean, the Italians were the great bankers of that time. And, this was an Italian bank called the Bardi, who were based in Florence. And they were helping to finance his voyages, while at the same time they were also helping to finance voyages from Spain by sort of Christopher Columbus and others. So, from their point of view, I kind of think these bankers, I've heard just sort of slightly disparaging comments about bankers earlier, but from their point of view, I think you might sort of say it shows that you can never trust bankers because they'll always just be going after the bottom line. They were doing things which the Spanish were very unhappy about, but they were just backing anyone they thought they could make money out of.
It was, I think, also maybe telling that it wasn't a Bristolian captain that they chose to make the voyage. It was a foreigner. Did Cabot have particular skills?
I think, he had knowledge, certainly. He'd been trading in the Mediterranean. He claims he visited Mecca, which is probably unlikely, but he had certainly been trading with the sort of Ottoman Empire before he came to Bristol. So he had knowledge of the routes east, and at the end of the day, we've got to remember he wasn't looking for America. He was hoping to sail across the Atlantic, hoping to find a route to Asia from which he'd be able to start trade with. So that's what he was after. He had that knowledge. He's somebody who comes across, to be honest, as somebody who's got as much as anything but sort of a gift for gab. He's a very good salesman. Before he came to Bristol, he'd actually been trying to sell himself as a civil engineer in Spain, building a bridge over at Seville, for instance, over a river. Wasn't successful, got made unemployed, and then comes to these Bristol merchants and says, I can find a route for you. I know you've been searching for a route across the Atlantic. You've been looking for lands across the Atlantic for the last couple of decades, but I can help you do this. I have the knowledge.
I'm your guy.
Yeah.
Also, the sort of world he was in at the time was very much governed, or certainly in the background, one of the things we don't necessarily think much about, by not the Bristol's merchant venturers who came afterwards. They were only got their charter in 1552, I think.
It was the same guys, to be honest. I mean, it's the same group of people who, of the same merchant class, which, to be honest, ruled Bristol pretty much from about the 11th century up until kind of really the 19th century or so. I mean, this city is...
The sons of the previous generations?
Either sons or people,
families?
or sometimes the same families, sometimes people who've been apprenticed in. I mean, it's a fairly fluid in that sense. But yes, sometimes you get sort of multiple generations of merchants, but it's the same kind of oligarchy class. I mean, there are people who also rule the city. They're the ones who are most of the mayors and the sheriffs and MPs of the city. And I mean, you've got to remember, really, until the 19th century, Bristol's economy was almost entirely based on overseas trade. I mean, that's what made this city tick. That's why Cabot came here. You've got to remember, in the 15th century, it was the second most important city, really, in England. It was a rich city from the Middle Ages onwards.
And the slave trade certainly didn't disparage from that. In fact, it expanded massively because of the slave trade. But let's just go back to the 1200s and the 1300s and the Hanseatic League and the merchant adventurers. Not the merchant venturers. The merchant adventurers were a kind of... people would point to them at the day, I would imagine, as saying, actually, you guys are a bunch of monopolists. You're just trying to control all the trade and stop other people getting in. Who were the Hanseatic League and these people?
Well, I mean, these are sort of different groups. So the Hanseatic League were a kind of a group of North German towns, places like what's Gdansk, well, what's now Gdansk, was then Danzig, Hamburg, Lübeck, all these sort of cities around the Baltic, which formed a great sort of merchant trading network. And yeah, they were trading, but they were trading mostly with London and across the North Sea. They didn't have much trade with Bristol. And then you get the Italians of a kind of a really great international traders of this period and bankers in the sort of 15th century. But I mean, what was
mostly Venetian, but Venice, basically?
Venice, Genoa, Florence, mostly those three sort of great city-states. But they were the sort of the chief bankers. But Bristol was different. I mean, it may be interesting that actually most English... I mean, people often think of Britain as being a sort of naturally somehow geared to the sea, but it wasn't involved much in overseas trade at this time. And Bristol was actually distinctive in the sense that Bristol had this large trade, and it was mostly controlled by local men using local ships rather than using things like foreign ships and leaving it to the actual foreign merchants to actually do the trade. So that's one of the reasons why Cabot came to Bristol, that Bristol had a long-standing interest in a heavily developed overseas trade, trading as far as Iceland to the north and as far down as the Straits of Gibraltar to the south. So we had this very big, extensive trade network already, and that's why they were interested in trying to expand their trade and look for new lands. And that's why Cabot came here.
We know about Victorian-era shipbuilding, but did Bristol build these sorts of ships in medieval times as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and they had some of the greatest ships in the realm. I mean, during this period, you get ships of several hundred tons, 500, 600, 700 tons, which is actually very big compared to the standard of most shipping at that time. It wasn't quite as big as the great Genoese carracks, which sailed between the Eastern Mediterranean and Northern Europe. But they were very great ships by that time, yes.
I remember reading, this is a while ago, but I think I'm right in saying that the finest sailing ships were the clippers, and they could actually go faster than the powered ships, coal ships, and people still like using the clippers because they didn't have to fill half the hold-up with coal to power the steamships. So there was still quite a use for sail right up until Victorian times. But the merchant adventurers, I think we need to just sort of separate them from our own Bristol merchant venturers. They were closed down. I'm not sure what the date was. Is it they lost their charter in 1689 because they were accused of being too monopolistic.
Are you talking about the merchant adventurers of London?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I think they were from Holland and Belgium and London. They had various bases.
They Yeah, the merchant adventurers of London, they secured in the sort of end of the 15th century the monopoly on the export of English woolen cloth, which was the main export England produced at this time, to the Netherlands, basically. And that was a very major trade, and by the end of the 16th century, most of actual English trade consisted of the merchant adventurers exporting woolen cloth. This is about 90% of English exports to the Netherlands. So places like Bristol, has to be said, were kind of fairly peripheral to that. And yes, they lost a lot. I mean, I think, to be honest, all groups of merchants tended to be, Adam Smith, says that, you get 2 or 3 merchants or businessmen together and they will try to combine to defraud the consumer.
Yeah, I think the conversation usually ends in a conspiracy against the public.
Yeah.
I think there's something like that, isn't it? Martin, let me bring you in here, because we're talking here about trade deals. We're talking about organisations like the Hanseatic League, the Merchant Adventurers, the Merchant Adventurers, that were associations of merchants. But actually, we haven't gone that far from that. We're now talking about a massive trade deal called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership as well. Bigger deals with bigger organisations of merchants around the world deciding what they want to do.
Well, there's clearly a historical continuity between this kind of globalised capitalism. I mean, it was, we're talking about people doing stuff for money, aren't we? That's the continuity. Although I did understand that it was the Crown, Henry VII, wasn't it, that pushed this expedition. So, and you were saying that in both Spain and in the Bardi were funding all of this, but I think they wanted the public sector, if you like, the Crown involved, because it's risky, and the Crown's taking some of the risk. And
the Crown, the Crown doesn't provide finance. In fact, the only time, they don't provide finance. Henry VII doesn't provide finance. What he actually provides is political guarantees. Yeah. By giving them letters patent, which is a grant to carry out these voyages. It means 2 things. It means, first of all, if he discovers new lands, then other people can't sail there. So this is trying to protect the investment. And what he doesn't want to do is sail there, discover a new route to Asia, and come back and say, I've discovered a new route to Asia, and then everyone else says, that's great, you've spent all this money doing it, but now we can just muscle in and trade. So it's providing a monopoly versus other potential merchants in England, but it's also meaning that he's getting to sail under the King's flag, flag, which means that anyone who attacks his ship, and if the Spanish or Portuguese could potentially have done this, if they attacked his ship, they'd be attacking the King, and that would provoke a diplomatic incident. So what the King is doing is providing political guarantees, which aren't unimportant.
No, well, I mean, and I think the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership and so on, the geopolitics of free markets. I mean, if you're a free market economist, then you don't need trade deals. Everybody just deals with everybody else on an open basis. And having trade deals implies that you've actually got a closed system and you're negotiating about how it's going to be managed, rather than having a free market
system. Hang on a minute, because what you're doing with the trade deal is you're saying, well, actually, we're not going to be putting excises on products as they're coming in and out of the country, sure.
Yeah, but I mean, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership and the Asian Investment Partnership is basically designed to contain Russia and China. They are geopolitical goals. We've got sanctions on Russia at the moment. Goodness knows why, because we're the main aggressors in the Ukraine and in Syria. But we've got sanctions on them, and we're perhaps going to come to discuss this BBC war game programme later in the show. But I mean, the fact is that just from a logical point of view, having a trade and investment partnership which actually locks in the European Union to the US, which is what it's all about, basically, is designed to lock the Russians out. And there's no free market here at all. What we're talking about is manoeuvring to control monopoly, effectively.
Sounds like,
and that was the same in the medieval era. There was no free market then either.
It's getting even tighter though than it was in medieval times. And essentially, what the merchants are trying to do here is to shut out the competition more and more nowadays. But anyway, I know you've been looking into this woman Alwyn Ruddock and some of her work on John Cabot. So, how did you first come across her work, and why is it important, do you think?
Well, she was a historian based at the University of London for sort of 30 or 40 years, from the 1950s to mid-1970s. And she carried out basically, during the early 1960s, she discovered a set of documents while working in Italy to do with John Cabot and the discovery voyages, which were really important because we know very little about these voyages. I mean, some of the documents, she discovered new letters. She discovered, actually, the accounts to do with Bardi, which I mentioned. And then for about 30 or 40 years, she kept saying she was going to publish her findings, but she never let go. She couldn't just let go and publish. Instead, she was always looking for the next bit of evidence. And when she got finally aged 89 in 2005, when she died, she left these very peculiar instructions, which she wanted all her research notes burnt and destroyed, because I think she was paranoid that other people were going to find this stuff and then pretend it was their own. So she spent 40 years, to be honest, acting as dog in the manger in this area. I mean, she was an extremely good scholar. She clearly had found a lot of information. She stopped anyone else from doing any research on it because no one else wanted to go in and do something and then find out, that she had been preempted by her publications. And then she dies in 2005, and it all kind of gets destroyed. And that's kind of where I got involved, because as an academic, as a historian who works on this area, this kind of rather upset me, I might say. And, what I wanted to do was actually see if she could actually find out initially what it was she'd found, because she'd always been very cagey about it. And then later on, once we actually worked that out, find out if we could actually relocate any of the documents she found, with, I should say, due acknowledgement to her having found many of these things.
So how did you get on?
Well, we found quite a few of the documents, partly through contacts relating to her, and partly simply by looking at the sort of places we think she would have looked at. We found, for instance, evidence of a new voyage we'd never known about, which took place in 1499 from Bristol, led by a Bristol merchant called William Weston. I mean, this was actually the first English-led expedition to North America, and nobody had even realised it had happened. No one ever heard of this Bristol merchant, William Weston. So that's kind of one of the things we found. I mean, there's various other things which are very interested in finding. I mean, including her claims that she thinks that a group of friars who sailed with Cabot in 1499 on his last voyage actually established a colony in Newfoundland, a religious colony in Newfoundland, and that would be the first church, the first Christian colony in North America, which obviously people in Canada and so on are very excited about. So we're looking for that.
No archaeological evidence for that yet, though?
No. We know where she thought it was, a place called Carbonear in Newfoundland. And so we know where it was, and there has been some archaeological, but the actual whole area has actually been built over quite heavily now. And if it was, she wasn't suggesting it was more than possibly a year or two that this actual colony survived.
It occurs to me we ought to mention Prester John at this point, who is the guy that kept everybody guessing for centuries. In fact, because I think he maybe you could explain this a little bit better than me, Evan, but I think he was basically a fake letter put out by the Vatican that said that there was this Christian king who ruled the three Indies, that was fighting the Muslims from the other side, and that we all had to fight the Muslims to help this fictitious king, Prester John. But it actually kept many explorers gripped for centuries, and kings, and in fact, the whole continent was trying to help this guy that never existed at all.
A lot of people think that the actual stories of Prester John, and it wasn't just about the Vatican, were actually based in true information about the Christian Copts of Ethiopia, who were on the kind of other side of the sort of the Ottoman Empire, and that these and obviously
so there was an element of truth.
There were Christians. I mean, they weren't people very much regard themselves as Christians today. I mean, but they were a very separate religious tradition from the Roman Catholic tradition. So there were Christians kind of on the other side of the Islamic Empire. He wasn't as rich or powerful as they thought these people were going to be. There wasn't a single individual called Prester John. Obviously, would only be no one lives for hundreds of years anyway. But yeah, there was a belief that many of the early explorers, backed by Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese king, were hoping to sort of get beyond the Sahara Desert, and that one of the things they thought they'd be able to do by doing this would be to sort of link up with the Prester John and fight the Ottoman Empire and the sort of Kingdom of Morocco and these places, which are seen very much as the enemy at the time.
Well, we can smile now, but this actually did, a lot of policy on a national level was based around this being fact. It's amazing that people can get things so wrong for so long.
Well, they had other reasons for going as well. I mean, the chief reason for sailing down the coast of Africa was they wanted to get the gold, which is coming out of sub-Saharan Africa, and which the Moroccan Kingdom of Morocco were taking on caravans across the Sahara Desert.
So Prester John was a convenient excuse, maybe.
He was one of the reasons, but probably not the main reason. And certainly, actually, once they got down to the Gold Coast and started bringing back gold and other goods, ivory and so on, they were more interested in the bottom line, I think, than they were in than anything else.
Evan, where's a good place for people to go to read about this or to catch up, and maybe good documentaries online, or to get up to date with the Bristol's role in the Cabot voyage?
I mean, there's one of the difficulties.
They could probably come and do a course up at the university.
Yeah, they can sort of come and sort of do a course. There's various things we have on the website which we've sort of published and which is freely available articles. I mean, one of the things which I've done is we partly try not to be like Alwyn Ruddock, because she's such a peculiar woman, that I've made sure that every time we published anything, it's been made publicly available. And so there's lots of stuff about our research which you can find out about, which will also provide background to the voyages, which is freely available online. So if you sort of Google the Cabot Project, just Google Cabot Project, you'll find those links. Is there much left
in Bristol, records from these times? I mean, they've got an almost public archive, haven't they?
The Bristol Record Office.
Yeah, etc.
There's not a huge amount from the 15th century, and very little which relates to Cabot. I mean, one of the funny things about Cabot is that, we think of him as being famous today, but at the time he was just another merchant, and people weren't that interested. So, for instance, when you look at Bristol's Town Chronicle, which is written during this period, you look at the entries for the 1490s, and they're full of things like, the king visiting Bristol, and the repaving of Broad Street, and mending the city quays and so on. And this is what the town clerk is writing about, the really important things happening in Bristol. What he doesn't write about at all at any point is the Bristol discovery voyages, or really anything else to do with merchants, because I think they just regard it as merchants' business. They don't regard it as being that important to the time. And it only seems to be important to them, a century or more later, after you get efforts to sort of start colonising North America by the French and the English.
Any good books?
Nothing really kind of recent. I mean, I'm actually working on a sort of more sort of popular history booklet, which will probably be sold through at least the Mafia of Bristol at the moment, because partly I want to try to sort of communicate this stuff to a broader audience. So that will hopefully be coming out in the sort of next couple of months, but I don't want to be sounding as if I came on here to plug this.
Okay. I suppose we should finish where we started, really, which was Martin's comment a few weeks ago about the Grand Banks. Martin, do you just want to remind us what you were saying and see if Evan can verify?
This is all fascinating. I'm just aware that I read, and you may be aware of this, that the idea that the Bristol merchants had discovered the Grand Banks, but as you said, they weren't really fishermen. And, of course, the idea that in this book, I can't remember who wrote it, the idea that America was possibly named after a Bristol Welsh merchant, Ap Merrick.
Yeah, Richard
rather
Ap Merrick.
Than Amerigo Vespucci.
Who you would love, actually, by the way. He's a fantastically corrupt guy, originally from Chepstow, and he's massively on the make. I mean, we've been pursuing this guy. We found out loads and loads of evidence of him being involved in various fraudulent activities in the 1490s, getting trouble with the king, having to
This is Ap Merrick?
Yeah, this is Ap Merrick. But we've found, but to be honest, there's absolutely zero evidence that he was actually financing or supporting John Cabot.
I thought you were talking about the author of the book.
No. I mean, I
realise that it's not academic history.
No, I'm not.
It's an interesting. It was an interesting idea, but I mean, I bow to your superior knowledge.
Well, it's based on the fact
more about it than I do.
It goes back to the late 19th century, and it's based on the fact that people write names. I mean, one of the sillier things you'll ever hear about, say, Shakespeare is like, he can't possibly have written all these plays because he spells his name in lots of different ways. Yeah. I mean, actually, everyone did that all the time. You would do that, if you were to, you just think, actually, I feel like spelling my name this way today. And people like Richard, he's a Welshman, really, Richard Ap Merrick from Chepstow. But he writes his name, or people write his name in lots of different ways. I mean, sometimes it's Richard Americ, sometimes it's Richard Merrick.
Quite a lot of crooks do that, don't they?
But in this period, everyone does it. I mean, John Cabot, as I say, is an example. I mean, when he was in Venice, he's Juan Caboto. He goes to Florence, he's Giovanni Caboto. He goes to Spain, he's Juan Caboto. He comes to England, he's John Cabot. That's not because he might have been a crook, but that's not the reason he was doing it. It's just that that's what everyone did in that period. They weren't as kind of, worked up. I mean, sometimes I get my students saying, I'm not Sophia, I'm Sophia. And, people get very worked up about their name forms, but in this period, they just didn't. No. And anyway, so one version of Richard Merrick's name is written Richard Americ, and in the late 19th century, someone said, that looks rather like America. Perhaps this guy, actually, Cabot, comes back and he names it after him. Unfortunately, there's no evidence for it. I mean, he's a Bristol's customs officer. He's the man who pays Cabot his pension, his annual salary from the king. But really, the only connection, he's basically the tax man. The king is paying out of revenues collected in the port of Bristol because that's where the king has a pot of money and he wants to pay Cabot his pension. So that's the only known connection we have. Between
so is it Vespucci? Because I've heard rumours that he changed his name as well. It wasn't his original name or something.
Well, yeah, I'm going to go. Vespucci is, I mean, there's very strong
Portuguese?
case. He's actually another Italian, actually, but it's he sails, and a map written in 1507 actually names the continent of America after him, and there's a legend on the map. There's some writing on the map where he says, he has a picture of Vespucci and says, I'm naming it after him. But actually, at that time, it was only applied to South America. The name America doesn't start getting applied to North America until about 50 or 60 years later. So it would be kind of a very odd thing for this land, which, at the end of the day was around Newfoundland, which the Bristol people had been exploring, to actually somehow that name to transfer itself down. Quite apart from the fact, by 1507, the map maker is very clear about who he's naming it for.
They've realised that the two are joined in Central America. They're, of course...
But they don't realise that at that stage. They don't actually... No? I mean, Columbus, one of the things about Columbus, Columbus is such an idiot, but he goes there thinking it's the Indies. By the time of his death in 1506, 14 years later, he still thinks it's the Indies. I mean, everyone else by that time has worked out those these big continents away, but he thinks that this is Asia because he was so set on discovering Asia that he's convinced it has to be. But at that time, up until really... I mean, apart from possibly the Bristol discovery voyages, which I think probably did explore down quite a lot of the coast of America at this time, there's no record actually of the Spanish reaching any part of North America until about 1513.
We don't see much of the Matthew in the floating harbour these days. Seems to be off most of the time.
It's around quite a bit. It was undergoing every year. It has to be taken out of water down on the Underfall yard, and it was out of there for a few weeks, I think, while they were doing its annual maintenance check, but I think it's back in the water again now.
Anyway, it's been a great pleasure, Evan
Jones.
Evan Jones, sorry. Thanks very much for joining us, and people can find I'll put a link on our show page to your Cabot Project pages up at the university. Thanks very much for joining us today. On the Politics felt a little bit like Melvin Bragg in our time today. Not quite so bang up to date with news, but certainly fascinating for me anyway. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now let the music play.